Okay, let us go into the Imrei Yaakov on this halacha of Meitzer Shehechaziku Borabim. So we learned yesterday that if there is a pathway that has been forged by people who have been using a property as a shortcut, then as long as we can ascertain that the owner was mochel, that he did not say anything and he allowed the public to pass through, then he does not at some time later have a right to evict the public from his property and to plow over the pathway and use it for some other utility. So the Imrei Yaakov over here says, Meitzer shehechaziku, if there is a property or a strip of property that has become used by the public, yesh omrim dedafka im hameitzer hu rachav taf zayin ama alav hachilo. There is an opinion that can be found in the Rambam that states that this halacha is only true if it's a pathway that's 16 amos wide. And only then do we say that the public has now sort of acquired the property because the owner has not protested because it's a very wide pathway. And the definition of a rishus harabim, of a public thoroughfare, is 16 amos wide for the purposes of Hilchos Shabbos, and it's therefore the definition of a rishus harabim for our purposes here as well. But others disagree. And they say that even if the pathway is less than 16 amos, the 16 amos is very wide. It's like the width of Bathurst Street. So it seems that would be very difficult to satisfy the Chayniker, but others disagree. And they say that that's not, it's irrelevant how wide the path is. This halacha still holds that once it started, it's been an accepted shortcut that the public uses to walk through this guy's property, and the guy has not protested. So then he cannot at some time later take it away from the public. Shehechaziku, that the public took possession by using it as a shortcut. So he explains that it's a lot of biurim. He says, one second. He says, Vidavka birishus. This is only if they started walking through the property, the private property, with permission of the owner. Mihu kol sharabim muchzakim bo atalefanenu toanim lahem the amrinon de bevadai birishus echaziku bo. He says, and what if you don't know, right? In other words, what if you don't know that permission, whether permission was granted or not by the owner? He says the very fact that the public is currently using it, and it's now been a significant amount of time that the public has been using it. So this in itself is the evidence that we argue on behalf of the public that this has been the long-standing custom. And therefore we are assuming that the public is using it with the permission of the owner, because otherwise the owner would have protested. And the way that they sort of stake their claim is just by virtue of the fact that the public is walking through. But it's also possible to create the facts on the ground that the public owns that pathway, not just by walking across the property regularly with regularity along that path line, but also if the public does some other kind of act to the ground itself upon which they wish to stake a claim. So, for example, let's say you see a guy going with a lawnmower, plow, and then I don't know how you make a pathway, a dirt pathway, but probably they have to uproot all of the growth and then pat down the earth um, or put down stones or something to that effect, even if the public hasn't walked through, the very fact that the public has a group of people have created a pathway through private property, and they've done so with impunity, is also a demonstration of ownership of that pathway by the public. V'yesh omrim the davka b'shavil shel kramim uchadoma she'en derech letaknu lahashvoso mishum hachi nikna b'hiluch greda. Some say that it's only when you're dealing with a field or a vineyard or something like an agricultural piece of property where it's unusual to forge a path and to find people, walking through it. That's the reason why when you find people walking through and creating a pathway, that's why the public acquires it. Aval makom she'asui lahaloch bo rabim shederech lahashvoso ulasakno bazelo moel hiluch bilbad. But let's say it's a type of property which, let's say, may be paved as a parking lot, and let's say it's a parking lot that's on the corner of a street, and people are now using it as a shortcut so that they don't have to walk all the way around the corner, but they walk diagonally through the parking lot. He says that by virtue of the fact that people are walking through it is not itself a demonstration that the public has become the owner of that pathway. Only, you see, right? So, I mean, that certainly stands to reason. Guy buys a corner lot on a property just because it's an empty lot or a dirt lot or a paved lot doesn't mean that because he allows people to walk through it, the public now can stake a claim on that pathway. It's simply because the reason why he doesn't protest is because they're not harming or changing or altering his property anyway by walking through it, right? It's only if they alter the utility of the property by walking through it and the owner doesn't protest, that's where we say that they've demonstrated that this now becomes the rights of the public. Because it's normally used for agriculture, like a cornfield or a vineyard, and the owner doesn't protest when people pat down a strip of the land in the middle, and they start walking through it. But so therefore, if it's like, let's say, a dirt lot that's not being used for anything, if the public were to go ahead and start paving a pathway, only then only then would we say that if the owner is aware of it and he doesn't say anything, then we can assume that he's allowing them to do it and he would not be able to take it back. But the main halacha is that it doesn't really matter what the circumstance is, as long as the public has demonstrated a pattern of walking through, they become the owners. But I think that in my situation, I think the Imrei Yaakov would agree, where the public is not in any way changing the use of the property, and they're not harming the property, then I think it would be harder to make this argument. Kasvu haposkim the din shel meitzer shechaziku bo rabim omer davke echadika chisarn behezek hiluch harabim. And this is what he says at the end. He says the poskim conclude that the only time that the public stakes a claim on a pathway is only when damage is caused to the property through the utility of the public by using it as a shortcut. Then, by virtue of the fact that he was silent, this is a sign that he is giving up a piece of his property to the public. But if there's no loss because it's a dirt lot or a paved lot, and it's like in my illustration of the corner piece of property, so then why would the guy protest? He doesn't care. He's not planning to build on the property for another couple of years. And so therefore, you can't say that the public has now an acquisition on the property. So, just to give you a perfect example, the shul's parking lot. We allow the public to use the shul parking lot as a walkway to get from York Hill Boulevard to Clark, right? But if we were to decide one day that we wanted to build on the property, or if we were to decide one day that we wanted to put a fence around the property for security, the public would not be able to make the argument that, hey, we have a staked claim on this parking lot as a shortcut to get from York Hill to Clark. And the argument being is because we, the proprietors of the shul property, did not protest for the last 30 years or 40 years, doesn't mean anything. It's because there's no damage of anything to speak of when we allow pedestrians to walk through our property. It's only if you're dealing with a property that through the use of the public, it compromises the quality of the soil, because now it can't be used for agricultural purposes. That's where we say that the fact that the owner was silent, it means that he's given up that pathway to the public. Okay? So that really certainly helps clarify things. And this long biurim that you see is really him going through the sources to point out that there are definitely limitations to this halacha based upon the circumstances. And that's really what he wanted to point out here in the Imrei Yaakov. Rabin, he says it's only when a pathway is utilized by the public. But a private individual who uses my field as a shortcut can never have come with claims against me when I decide to take away the utility of the pathway, unless I had previously given him explicit permission and not only permission to walk through, but I basically tell him, I'm hereby giving you as a gift this pathway, right? So then I can't take it back indiscriminately. I have to consult with him. But if I don't protest because one guy decides to use it as a shortcut, he can't claim later, if I decide to fence it off or build on it, that I've taken away his rights. This is only granted to a public entity of a whole community. So
Rabbi, he's not looking at whether or not the guy should be cutting across the property or not. I mean, he's not protesting, but it would seem to me there should be, or we're just not looking at the side of, whether this guy should cut across the property to begin with.
I mean, that's a very good point, Wayne. The fact of the matter is that we learned previously that you're not supposed to be taking anything off of private property, even if you've made the assumption that the guy doesn't mind. Remember, we learned as far as taking produce from his property. So I think we're building upon that halacha that we learned before. And based on that halacha, if I know that I'm causing damage to a person's property by walking through it habitually, then it would stand to reason that it's no different from, let's say, taking produce from him. It's only when I come across a field and it's on my way home and I see that there's this pathway that's already there. That's what gives me the right to do it. It's very possible that the first people who started walking through, if they started to do it without permission, they may have been guilty of some kind of damage. But then once the owner just basically accepts it and he allows it to go on and doesn't mind, so then it's permitted for other people to go ahead and do it. It's also possible that if I find a pathway through someone's property, it's possible that the owner himself may have patted down that area to make it into a path because he wanted to accommodate, other people. Or maybe a group of people came to the owner and said, would it be okay if we walk through your property? So therefore, I don't have to worry that I'm in violation of trespassing when I see a pathway through someone's property that clearly other people have been using. Then I'm not guilty of trespassing. But if there's a big no trespassing sign, right, and then obviously just because other people are doing it doesn't give me the right to do it. Okay? All right.
Rabbi, on that very last point, would that be considered a sufficient protest? Someone puts up a no trespassing sign, but still doesn't take any action?
I would think so. I would think that putting up a no trespassing sign is sufficient. That's clearly a protest. Maybe just doesn't have the resources to do more right now, because let's say he doesn't have the money to start a lawsuit, or he doesn't have money to put up a fence or whatever. What else would physically obstruct people from using it? Puts up a no trespassing sign and just hopes that people will honor his wishes.
So that would stop the claim of the public as well.
I think so.
Right. And the other aspect I was wondering about is if the owner is absent and is not able to protest. He's overseas or he's in jail or something. I don't know.
Right.
And so
if he was able to make that case that I wasn't around to be able to protest, the Beis Din would honor that and they would give him a right to cover it over. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Sure. So Asr Lakalkalo, the owner is not allowed to destroy the path that has already been forged by the public. Yesh Omrim the Dafka Kishigomar Bedaito Shayuchla Derech Zer Larabim Laolam. So again, there's a difference of opinion here. Under what circumstances do we say that the owner is not allowed to destroy the pathway? Excuse me. So under what circumstances? So some say that it's only when the owner had already made a decision in his own mind that he was permanently giving this away to the public. Right? But what if it's clear based on circumstances that it wasn't his intention to permanently cede that pathway to the public? It's only that he did it temporarily because he wasn't planning, let's say, to build on that property or to plant on that property for a couple of years. So he says, listen, while it's empty and it's an empty lot, let the public use it. So Bazelo Zachu Bo Harabim. And in that kind of scenario, you cannot say that the public has a legal claim on that pathway just because the guy decided that he didn't need it yet. And so he decided, listen, if I don't need it, it's no skin off my nose if the public uses it temporarily. He says, Umaisim b'chol yom shebnei adam manichim migrashim penuyim ad sheyivnu sham ba'ayin biurim. He says it's quite common that people leave empty lots of land and they don't protest for the public to walk through it. But then when they decide that they're going to build, that's when they fence it off. And that's perfectly legal. Any landowner has a right to do that. It's only if there's been a long-standing tradition to allow people to use the property and there was no intent expressed at any time that the person was going to be using this for any other use other than a garden or a park or something like that. So then he doesn't have a right to take it back from the public. So let's say this is what the Biurim takes up over here. He says, "V'yesh la'ayin ha'im ha'meitzer niknu legamrei l'rabim." So he says, what does that mean? Do we say that the pathway it becomes the property of the public? Behem nasim al zeh be'alim gemurim, and they become really the owners of that pathway. Or are we just saying that they have rights of passage? And rights of passage doesn't mean that the public owns the property, but they have rights of passage, which is a totally different kind of legal acquisition. But it's not that they actually own the actual property. B'hanafkamina, what would be the practical difference? De'im b'meshech hazman yitbatel legamri. The pasek shem derech harabim me'iza siba shehi. V'rotzim livnot sham. Let's say for whatever reason the public stops using the pathway, and then the owner decides that he's going to build on that property. Az zechut haba'alut shayach lebal hasada v'lo letzibur. He says in that kind of scenario, when the public originally was using it for years, then for whatever reason the public stopped using it, and then the owner wants to build on it, so then he would have that right. Ulanias daiti mistaver shezeh shayach leba'alim mishum dahad kaimelan demetzer shechziku bo rabim asalakal kolotaima demilta. He says, and it would seem to me that it's the owner's right to build once the public stops using it. He says, because the whole reason is because the kaven dahaba olim yadu b'shasku b'vaday machalahem is because when a landowner is silent and forgives, it doesn't protest when people start walking, it means that he's allowing them to use his property. And therefore, it's when a person is silent and he gives permission to the public to walk through his property, he doesn't mean to say, I'm giving up that property to the public. All he's doing is giving them rights of passage. He doesn't mean to, he's not transferring title of that pathway to the public at all. Okay? Let's see if someone have a comment here. Does it apply to government-owned property? What is happening now in Israel with Bedouins moving onto land and using it? That's an interesting situation, right? It would seem that, that's the same idea. If the government owns property and the government is allowing people to squat on it, that doesn't mean that the government automatically cedes the property, just like any other entity is not ceding the property to those squatters, right? It's just giving them rights of use. And, so it has to be determined what the government actually said in that situation, because they're letting Bedouins live on it. Does that mean that the Bedouins become the owners? No, his argument is the Bedouins have attained a certain right of squatting. But if it was only given to them temporarily, you'd have to, that has to be taken up in the courts, I guess. Okay, and he goes through this in the Biurim that it's not that the property belongs to the public, it's just that they have rights to pass. Okay, so let's go on to the next piece in the Imrei Yaakov, Midas Haba Olim, as long as it was done with the knowledge of the owner. Abalim hachaziku shelo birshus lo. But if it was done without permission, and it was just done, basically by fiat, without consulting the owner, and the owner is clearly unhappy with it, then they don't even acquire rights of passage. But if the owner was forgiving, even though the owner did so innocently without even realizing that giving the rights of passage on his property could have permanent ramifications, it still is legally binding. And like we saw in this secondary halacha in the Sif yesterday, is that let's say the owner mistakenly thought that it was up to him to decide which path the public uses. So there was a pathway on the more southern area of his property. He decides to create a new path in the north. So we said that ironically, even though he's ceded a new path in the north for the people to walk through, but he doesn't have a right to reclaim the southern path, because once people have been using it, he cannot unilaterally change the utility of his property that the public has already been using for such a long time. He says, "V'hainu dafka b'derech shekol misha rotza over sham afilu mimekamos acherim, az habidina dezachu b'shneihem." Only in a scenario where it's a completely public thoroughfare that people who come from all over have been using the southern path, then we say that just because he created a northern path does not mean that he gets to reclaim the southern path. The derech harishon shahaya muchzak biyad harabim ad achshav ein koach biyadu levatel suchus harabim da'alma, because a person does not have a right to undo the rights of a public entity, of a whole public group of people. He can't take away their rights. And therefore, even the northern path that he knowingly gave them now also becomes theirs. But then he gives another caveat, and that is, what if it's used by the public, but only by a small group of public individuals? Let's say it's only for a group of people in a neighborhood, and no one else uses it, right? So then in that kind of situation, the az osen b'nei ha'ir v'afilu zayin tov ha'ir l'chud yacholon lahachlif oso haderech b'derech acher u'miyim chabiyadam. So if it's only used by the members of a particular municipality, then the representatives of the municipality, the city council, if you will, has the right to change the pathway, because since they've been given legislative rights over an entire group of people within that municipality, they have the right to change that pathway because they represent that public interest. And therefore, like a government entity would be allowed to change rites of passage for anyone that is part of that, under the rubric of that government entity. So I guess that would help also answer the question from, I don't remember who CK is, but that would also answer the question of the Israeli government. If the Israeli government controls that property, and they control the public's use of that property, so then it seems like they have even more power than the owner himself. Essentially, what we're saying is that when a government entity has complete control of all the people that are passing through that property, because they're all part of that municipality, then the government does have a right to change the pathway. Okay. So now the Imrei Yaakov is going on the part that says that if there was a pathway that was going through his property, that it was made as a permanent pathway, or that was expressly given to the public for that purpose. So then if he changes that and tries to eliminate that pathway to make another pathway in the north, that's not legal. But that's only when he does it for a pathway that's being utilized by the public, but not if it's being utilized by a private individual. For a private individual, you always have a right to take away and to rescind his rights of passage. Okay, so just see if there's anything else here. So just in this Likutim, we'll just do this very quickly. Asr lekalkalo, you're not allowed to destroy the pathway. Yesh omrim dim yesh lo tabu ala karka. Some say that if a person holds a title to the property itself, as lo amrinam dim yistama machal, then we don't say that his tacit allowance of people to walk through constitutes a true forgiving of those rights. Which is a game changer, because if a person can demonstrate that he holds title to a property, then that changes the halacha entirely. Another mitigating circumstance is, let's say it's not a regular pathway for the public, but they only use it when, let's say, there's a lot of mud on the regular street, on the regular road, and to avoid the mud, they walk through this guy's property. So it's only seasonal, right? That they use it. Az eno bichlal hechazika bo rabin. That also is not enough of a staking a claim on a property because it's not used continuously. And in general, he says it's unclear, quoting from the Shuvos of the Minchas Yitzchak, it's unclear whether the laws of Dina de Malchusa would apply nowadays if a person makes a claim that he doesn't want the public to use his property anymore. Because the law of the land in Israel would say that he has complete rights without having to make any further demonstrations. So the bottom line is that this halacha is not as practicable as we would think, right? In other words, there are many kinds of instances where, despite the fact that the public has been using a pathway through someone's private property, that the owner would be able to protest if he wants to change the use of the property. So, for example, if it was something where it was an empty lot, but he had planning all along to build on it and just was only temporarily giving the public rights of passage, that for sure he has always the right to reclaim that pathway. Another mitigating circumstance could be if, like he says over here, maybe the law of the land says that as long as you hold title, you can reclaim the use at any time. And there may be other circumstances where he didn't know the public was using it, or he put up a no trespassing sign, or he did other things. So there's so many different ways that this halacha can be mitigated. So it would really require a careful analysis of an individual situation before you could prevent a person from reclaiming property that really belongs to him. Okay, so we'll hold it here for today. And